I want to start by removing the wheel, 21mm socket, take all 5 of your lug nuts off, and then remove the wheel. Now that the wheel's off, let's remove this bolt that holds the brake hose in place, 12mm socket. There we go. Now with a 17mm socket, let's remove this bolt here, which is also your slider pin. Obviously this is in very poor condition here. Take this out. I've never seen one this rotted, but we'll clean this up. At this point, this caliper is pretty stuck on here, so what I'm going to do is try to get in here with my small pry bar and just compress the piston a little bit. That'll give me a little bit of movement back and forth, and hopefully this lets go of the pads. There we go. Pry this up. Make sure this hose is still unattached. Flip it up and then slide it off of this top slider here. There's no bolt at the top, it just slides off. Take it and set it aside out of your way. Now we can remove the brake pads. Now let's take off these two 14mm bolts that hold the bracket onto the knuckle. It's going to be a little tough to get in here. You'll need to find whatever tools you have that fit. For me, it's this 3/8 extension with this specific 3/8 socket. Let's try to remove this bolt. Perfect. Came out. My socket's stuck though, but that's whatever. Leave that in there for now because it's kind of stuck, and let's move to the bottom. Now take this out and watch out because it's going to want to fall. Catch it, remove your socket and the bolt. Here's your caliper bracket, set that aside. Now remove the rotor. Mine's actually coming free, but if yours is not, it's probably because it's seized onto the hub, unless you have your parking brake applied, in which case take that off. But if it's seized on the hub, just hammer right in between the studs. That should break it free. Let's clean up this dust that's in here with some brake parts cleaner. Just spray it all down. Next, I want to remove these top two springs. I'm going to grab some locking pliers, lock them on tight. That way you get a nice grip on it. Pull it up and off, and you can just let it hang in there. We'll remove it once the shoe comes off. For this lower one, I'm going to try and grab it right up here and just kind of pry it off like that. Perfect. Now we have to remove this spring retainer here. I'm just gonna pull the parking brake shoe out a little bit. That way I get better access to this little pin in here. Basically, I have to push in on this cap that holds the pin and spin it so that you can line it up with the slot where it comes out of. There it goes. That was a little scary. That's all right. Take this shoe out. And at the bottom, you have another spring right on the back side here. I can wait to disconnect that after this shoe comes off. Okay, let's try to do the same to this side. Let's lock some locking pliers onto this outer cap here. Push it in while holding the pin and twist it. That should at least get it close to unlocking. And then you can give it another twist. There we go. That pops right off. The shoes come off. Remove this spring at the bottom here. Get at least one of these shoes freed up. There we go. This is the frontward shoe. And then this one is actually attached on the parking brake cable. And to get this one out, you have to pull the spring back, slide this out, unhook it, and here's your rearward shoe. Now I want to transfer this parking brake lever from the old shoe to the new shoe. It's held on by this clip that's just squished in here. So you basically have to spread out the two ears that got tightened together. Hold this with some pliers to hopefully prevent it from spinning. As I try to open this up, there we go, it's working a little bit. Okay, a little more. I'm going to hold it with some larger pliers, that way it stops spinning. And I'm going to try and spread these out a little bit more. There we go. At this point, you can grab those same pliers and just squeeze it out of here. I'm going to hold it with some larger pliers, that way it stops spinning. And I'm going to try and spread these out a little bit more. There we go. Push this out. If you make enough of a space, you can actually just take it out like this with a screwdriver. Take out the arm. There's a little washer in here. Keep that. There we go. This is the washer I'm talking about. Leave that in there. It's important. There is no washer on the other side, so don't try and find one. I'm going to immediately transfer it over to the new shoe. That way there's no possible way I can install it backwards or anything. And I have a new one of these clips, but of course you can reuse your old one if it's still in good condition. Just make sure it clamps down. Sometimes if you reuse them too many times, they'll break. And of course then it's not secured on here. But basically, new or old, just squish it so it can lock in this parking brake shoe. This is tight enough, just like that. The two ends are touching. This is perfect. Let's install it. I have new pins, so I'm just going to take these old ones out, throw them away, push them out through the backing plate. There you go. Now I'm going to take some brake parts cleaner, soak this down just so it doesn't make a whole lot of dust. And then if yours is rusted, mine's actually not bad at all, but if yours is rusted, go ahead and scrub it. That way the shoes have a nice clean area to mount on. Okay, and rinse it down. I want to grease up this backing plate a little bit, but only on these little raised areas that you see here. This is where the shoes ride. You don't want grease anywhere else. It'll be kind of useless. I also like to put it up here where the shoes kind of meet together and pivot. Do the same on this other side. And on the bottom, you have this larger flat piece here. That's also where the shoes ride, so put some in there. And as a little bonus, I like to put it in here where the parking brake cable sits, because every time you engage it and disengage it, it goes back and forth and back and forth. And if it can slide on some grease, it's better than if it was dry. Now to reinstall everything, it might be easier to remove this wheel hub. I'm going to do it. You don't have to. You can get around just like removing it. But like I said, I think it'll make things a whole lot easier. So for me, 14mm socket, I'll remove all 4 of these bolts and this should come right out. A lot of times these will get stuck into the hub, so you'll need a hammer and very gently tap it off. There we go. Now let's reinstall this rearward shoe that has the parking brake lever. Hook the cable on. Bring this up, and then this is where it sits right here. So before I completely attach it, I'm going to put this rear spring on, or the lower spring on that goes on the rear hook, and then the other shoe. That way these two are attached down here. It'll be a lot easier to install this spring now than it will be once these are both attached to the backing plate. So bring this in like this. Take your pin, take your new pin if you have a new one, and slide it through the back. It'll come out through the front here. Bring it over. Now let's get the spring. Before the spring goes on, you have this little cap. Now the spring. Now you have this other cap here that basically will finish everything off and lock the shoe in. So you have to line up the pin with the slot on the cap. Make sure this is kind of in position wherever it lines up best. Hold the pin, push the cap through, twist it 90 degrees, and lock it on. Make sure this is still secured, kind of where it needs to be. Twist this back into place, and let's do the same to this side. Now let's grab this other pin. This one was not curved, It was straight, so push it through. Line up this shoe and put this on first, and then the spring. Okay, hold the pin, grab this cap, put that on. Let's grab some locking pliers, lock them onto this cap, push it through, rotate it 90 degrees, that's locked on. Now let's get the adjuster. If you have a new one, obviously you don't have to clean anything. If you don't, go ahead and clean it, and then you want to grease it up. You don't need a whole lot of grease, just enough for the threads to not seize in the future, and that way it can also slide smoothly in and out as it needs to be adjusted. Thread this on all the way. You want to start with it bottomed out completely and then go out from there. And now I'm going to take a little bit of grease and put it on the other end. This one's not threaded, but it just needs to slide around and twist in there. This is all set, so let's bring it over to the parking brake shoes here. Pull those out, set this in just like that, and obviously we will adjust as needed later, but for now I want to start with it compressed like I said. Now let's get the top springs in. You also have this up here, which goes on this shoe in that cutout, and right here with this spring, just like so. Make sure they fall into their corresponding grooves, and then you can take the spring. It doesn't matter which one you start first, but take the spring, let's put it over. You can either use a screwdriver for this, or I have the special tool. This basically just makes it so that when you hook it onto here, it doesn't slide off and the spring goes over. You can do the same thing with a screwdriver, just be careful because it might slip. Put this one in the smaller hole here. Let's do the same to this one. Kind of just slide it over. There we go. Make sure this is still in position. Parking brake shoes are secured. Let's get the hub back in. Let's slide this hub back in. Be careful, watch out for the springs. Make sure the bolt holes line up. You can use these holes to guide the bolts in and start them all by hand. Okay, there's one. When I torque them down, I'm going to tighten them in a cross pattern. That way this hub can seat itself fully and straight on the knuckle. You don't want it to be kinked to one side more than the other. Okay, let's snug these up and then torque them to 59 foot-pounds. Again, I'm going to go in a cross pattern. Oops. I'll just double check this first one because it was a little loose to begin with. Perfect. Now let's clean up this hub surface. You can use a wire brush and just scrape it basically if yours isn't too rusted. Mine is a little bit more rusted than I'd like for the wire brush, so I'm going to use a little sanding disc and clean everything up. That way the rotor has a nice flat surface to mount on. Let's apply some anti-seize on this. Try not to get it on the parking brake shoes as much as possible. If you do happen to get any on them, we'll just clean it up. Now put the rotor on. And now we have to adjust the parking brake shoes. As you can see, they're not even, well, they're just barely touching. So what has to happen now is pull it out, spin the hub here, and then that little adjuster wheel that we put on the bottom, you can reach from one of these holes here. This one's a little larger, so I'll go for this one. And just expand the shoes. I'll show you how much in a second. So I'm going to spin this adjuster. I'll give it a 2 or 3 turns, and then we'll try the rotor on again. Nope, still nothing. Got to keep going. A lot of times this is just a trial and error process. So just keep expanding it until you hear the brake shoes touching. Now you don't want a lot of drag on these. It's not like drum brakes. These are just parking brake shoes. So you don't want these to actually slow down the rotor as it's turning. Okay, I hear a little bit of drag here, and it's not really slowing it down much. So what I'm going to do now is actually go inside the vehicle, pull on the parking brake just once. That way it seats the shoes where they're supposed to be, and then we'll come and check it again. A lot of times that moves them in a way in which it actually becomes loose again, so you have to readjust. All right, so I applied the parking brake twice and took it off, and actually for me this made it a little too tight. So I'm going to take this off, and like I said, I don't want these actually gripping onto the rotor tight and slowing it down. I just want these to just barely touch. That way when you apply the parking brake, then it grips on. All right, so this is much better. You can hear them. What you're hearing right now is the parking brake shoes touching, but they're not actually gripping and slowing down. So this is perfect. We'll leave it here. Now let's get the caliper bracket back onto the rotor. Start that on. There we go. And move up to the top. Start this one on as well. I'm going to snug these up and then torque them to 34 foot-pounds. 34 foot-pounds. That's one. Second one. Let's put the pads in. Now we have to push in this piston. Before I push this in, I'm just going to wipe off the debris that's around it. Sometimes a lot builds up, and if you push it in like that, it actually goes into this dust seal and causes issues. Now I'm going to get my caliper depression tool, and they make different types, and if you don't have any of them, you can just use a large C-clamp or pliers or whatever you have. But basically, you just want to go slow, push this piston in to retract it. Again, you want to go slow. That's the key to this. You don't want anything to get damaged. And once it bottoms out, which is right here, you can release your tool. So now I'm actually going to take a rag and some brake parts cleaner and clean in here. I'm going to wet that down, take my rag, and I just want to wipe off the old grease that was in there from the old slider. You can use a bore brush if you'd like. There we go. And I also want to clean this ridge up with my wire brush. That way the boot can have a nice area to seal up against. It's not going to be perfect. This caliper's in pretty poor condition, but it'll do the job. And if I grease it up enough, it will make a nice tight seal. So I'm actually going to apply some grease right now. There we go. Make sure it's all the way around. The grease, like I said, will ensure that it seals up. I'm going to put a little bit of extra grease in here. And a couple more areas to grease up is the surface or the outer ring of this piston and these two ears. Putting grease on these two areas is going to help the pads operate quietly and smoothly. You don't need a lot. Okay, slide the caliper on and then over, set it down, and let's grab the bolt that mounts it on the bottom. And it was in pretty poor condition, so I cleaned it up. I did the best I could on the wire brush. It's not perfect. Honestly, I would suggest replacing it if yours looks like this. But I don't have a new one right now, so I'm just going to grease this one up, and it should do the trick. Grease this up. Try not to get it on the threads. You want grease on this shanked area. This is the slider part of this bolt. And I'm going to put just a little bit of extra grease in the boot here. Work this into the boot. Slide the pin in, and once you push it through all the way, make sure this boot is seated properly. Which for me it wasn't. Okay, once this boot is seated all the way, you can thread in the slider pin / bolt. Let's snug it up and torque it to 20 foot-pounds. Perfect. And now the brake hose with the 12mm bolt goes right here. Put that on. And let's snug this up. Let's get the wheel on. Put on all 5 of your lug nuts, bottom them out, and torque them to 76 foot-pounds. 76 foot-pounds. Perfect.